We are going to be talking about energy flow through the ecosystems. This is section 3 of chapter 3. When we are talking about the energy flow through ecosystems, what we're really referring to is the food chain. Food chains are a step-by-step way that we show the flow of energy through an ecosystem. Below here, you will see an example of an ecosystem from an Everglades. We start always with a producer. Remember, a producer is a plant. Producers are the base of all food chains and food webs. In this case, our producer is algae. It gets its energy directly from the sun. We follow the flow of the energy. The energy shows, or the arrows show the flow of energy. So the way that the arrows flow shows the direction of the energy. So the energy from the algae goes to the flagfish. The energy from the flagfish goes to the largemouth bass. The arrows point the way the energy is going. Food webs are more complex. They are actually a more accurate picture of actually what happens in an ecosystem. Food chains show only one flow of energy. Food webs show multiple flows of energy. So it shows all of the feeding patterns, all of the possible feeding patterns within an ecosystem. This is actually much more realistic because when we think about it, we don't eat just one thing, and neither do organisms in the wild. They feed on multiple things. So a food web shows a much more accurate picture than what a food chain does. A food chain shows only one flow of energy through the ecosystem. Food web shows multiple flows of energy. Food webs also would contain decomposers and detrivores. Remember, a lot of our producers or plants die without ever being eaten. So the decomposers would break that down, return that detritus into the soil, which would then be eaten by detrivores. And then other organisms will eat detrivores. So decomposers and detrivores all do have their place in the ecosystem, and they all do have their place within our food chain. And actually, when we talk about like decomposers, everything dies and breaks down. So eventually the energy from everything goes back into those decomposers because they will break things down and they will recycle them for other organisms to be able to use later. When we look at our food chains and our food webs, what we need to realize is that if something happens to an organism within a food chain or a food web, it's going to affect organisms further down in that food chain. So if we would look at this food web, what happens if something happens to our population of krill? Stop and think about that for a second. What would happen if we didn't have our krill in that food web? Well, what's going to happen is nothing's going to eat the algae. So the algae population is going to increase. But when we look at our other organisms that eat that krill, like the penguin and the petrel and the seal, they're going to be in trouble because they are not going to have their food sources. So those animals are going to start to lose numbers and die off. Your algae population will be increasing, but other things will decrease. But when we look at that, that's going to have an effect on the entire food web because now killer whales aren't going to have as much to eat either because things that are lower on the food chain are going to decrease in numbers because they don't have enough to eat. So this is something that is very much interconnected. And when something happens to one organism in the food web, it has effects on other organisms. We can show the different levels in our food webs and our food chains in something called an ecological pyramid. Those steps in a food chain or a food web are called trophic levels. A primary producer is always at the base of the food chain. They are always at the base of the pyramid. They make up the largest amount of organisms that we have. They have the most amount of energy available because they get their energy directly from the sun. As we move up our ecological pyramid or we move up our food chain, energy is lost at each and every step because organisms use some of that energy and then some of that energy is just lost through heat. So, food chains are normally no more than 4 to 5 long because they lose too much energy because they are using the energy as they go. There are different types of ecological pyramids, and we're going to talk about them. An ecological pyramid is a diagram that shows the relative amounts of energy or the amounts of organisms or the amount of living matter at each trophic level in a food chain. So at the base of each of the pyramids is where the most is found, and at the top of the pyramid, where it is narrowest, is the least amount. There are 3 types of ecological pyramids. There are energy, biomass, and numbers. An energy pyramid shows the relative amount of energy available at each trophic level. So as we go up, there is less and less energy available. So what that means is there's less and less organisms at each of those levels because there's not enough energy available for the bigger predators at the top. So at the bottom we have our producers, and at the top we have what would be our predators. Particularly, we normally call those ones at the top of the food chain, we call those our apex predators. We have pyramids of biomass and numbers. Biomass is the total amount of living things in a trophic level. So the higher up you go, the less biomass there is, the less numbers there are. A numbers pyramid is going to show the relative amount of organisms at each trophic level. We're now going to talk about section 4. Section 4 is cycles of matter. One of the key things to remember here is that, remember, energy cannot be created, or matter cannot be created or destroyed. So what happens is all of these things get recycled. So this ties into what we talked about last chapter with the biochemistry. All of those things, all of those nutrients, all of those elements, they get recycled through things called biogeochemical cycles. There are 3 parts to that. There is a biological, a geological, and a chemical process. So these things get broken down, it gets recycled and reused because, remember, it is key. Matter is never created nor destroyed. So when we talk about these biogeochemical cycles, a biological process is one where it is related to living things, where they recycle matter through the ecosystem through things like eating, breathing, or eliminating waste. Geological processes are things like rock erosion, volcanic eruptions, those things. Chemical processes are the ones where we have like the change of water into its form, solid, liquid, gas, the flow of water, and things like lightning. Those are your chemical and physical processes. One of the most important biochemical cycles that we can talk about is the water cycle. 90% of our water enters the atmosphere as water vapor, and that comes from bodies of water. 10% enters the atmosphere through leaving plants' leaves. Plants will open up and they will release water back into the environment through a process called transpiration. As the air cools, it cannot hold on to the water vapor anymore. Hot air holds more water vapor than cold air. Think about that. Hot summer days, the air feels hot and humid. Cooler days, we don't feel that humidity. Cool air releases its water vapor in the form of droplets. It helps form clouds. Those clouds will hold on to that water so long till it gets heavy, which will fall to the earth in the form of precipitation. Precipitation comes in the form of rain, snow, hail, sleet, or a combination thereof. On land, the precipitation will hit the surface and enter into rivers and streams through runoff. Think about our parking lot when it rains really, really bad or the snow's melting. It runs down through the parking lot into the stream. and our stream there then carries it off into the river. This is a form of runoff. Precipitation can also be absorbed down into the ground and go into what we call groundwater. This is a diagram to show you that process where we have water seeping down into the ground. It makes its way through the ground into rivers, streams, oceans. That water evaporates, falls back to the earth in the form of precipitation. There are other things that do this as well. We have nutrient cycles where the nutrients go from, say, animal's body. The animal eliminates waste. Some of the nutrients get passed back into the environment that way. When organisms die, all of the minerals and nutrients in that are in the organism's body pass from the organism back into the soil, and they get used again in the environment over and over again. So different cycles that we could talk about are the carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, and phosphorus cycle. All of these follow similar pathways to like the water does, and they get recycled through the environment multiple times. Please finish up these notes and then submit a copy of the notes for points through the assignments tab.